I still remember the concrete under my palms, rough, wet from an evening rain that had stopped a half-hour earlier, and the smell of someone's cheap cologne and burnt plant matter hanging in the air like a bad memory. It was supposed to be another stupid night with old friends, talk about music, trade jokes, pass something around, and pretend we weren't all nursing our own private hungers. I had no reason to be suspicious. The joint was offered casually, the paper soft between two fingers like a promise. I thought I'd smoked things 100 times before. I had never, in any honest sense of the word, been ready for what came after those first 2 inhalations. The first thing was taste. It wasn't the herbal, slightly bitter snap of cannabis, I knew. It was like someone had slid a coin across the back of my tongue and asked me to remember the sound. Metallic, hollow, like copper and old pennies. The smoke made my throat sting in a place I didn't know a throat could sting. My chest tightened. For a second, the kind of second that stretches until you can map its seams, I thought I was having an allergic reaction. My hands went numb. They weren't my hands anymore. They were gloves someone else had left on my lap. The room lurched with the dishonesty of a carnival mirror. Familiar furniture folded into angles my eyes could not reconcile. I remember trying to explain that I felt funny and getting a laugh I could not place. Voices sounded as though they'd been recorded, then sped up, the syllables chewed, the laughter the high, brittle kind you hear in a cartoon when someone realizes the cliff is beneath them. The ceiling breathed. Light slithered along it in thin, living lines, as if the plaster had been a skin and something beneath it, a separate, patient creature, was inhaling and exhaling. I tried to stand. Gravity betrayed me. My feet were nailed to the floor, or perhaps the floor had become a memory and I could no longer find its edges. Panic is an animal that organizes thought into a spotlight. Mine shone on one small, horrifying fact. I had smoked something I did not know the name of. That name, Salvinorin B ethoxymethyl ether, sat somewhere at the edge of awareness, a syllabic itch that kept reforming into a chemical shape I could not gnaw. The name felt obscene, like a language only used to summon things that live behind doors. The walls pulsed, not metaphorically. They really did, like a heart beating out of cadence. Paint peeled like old skin. Where the plaster had gone missing, darkness had pooled and begun to breathe. It rose from the baseboards in slow, patient tongues, pooling into shapes that first looked like shadows and then decided to be animals. Each darkness had a mouth. The mouths had teeth. They clicked together, never closing, like the clack of geological jaws. I remember hearing a phrase, whispered all around me, from every angle, as though the room itself had teeth. We don't belong here. It was the kind of language that makes your own memories sound like lies. The sentence repeated and rewrote itself until it became the first stanza of a prayer I had never learned and could never unlearn. Time broke. That's the clinical way of putting it. Time didn't just slow or speed, it unspooled. Moments hung inside each other like Russian dolls. An entire conversation bloomed into being and died while the smoke still curled from my lips. I watched myself laugh. I watched myself not laugh. I watched the instant my hand moved toward the ashtray, as if I were inside a looped film reel, and someone else controlled the projector. I felt like a puppet, and the strings were made from my bones. The hallucinations weren't pretty. They were not the psychedelic garden I'd seen in movies, not the colorful kaleidoscopes of lullaby metaphors. This was aggression dressed as geometry. Corners sharpened until they were knives. Hallways lengthened into tunnels that kept opening into smaller, identical rooms with the same strip of dirty carpet and the same dented lamp blinking like an indifferent eye. Each repetition felt like an accusation. Then came the faces. At first there were only distortions. Reflections in a window melted into smeared caricatures of the people I loved, but soon full, impossible faces detached from the air and walked into the room. They were not human in any honest way. Faces are supposed to orient you. They are maps you can use to find sympathy, anger, Boredom. These faces inverted that map. Their mouths were too wide, stretching across cheekbones as if someone had borrowed the grin of a comic strip and sewn it into real flesh. Eyes were too close, or too high, or framed by folds of shadow like curtains. One of them, if it can be called one, leaned toward me and exhaled. The breath was a sound and a smell and a statement. It smelled like rust and wet ash, like the residue on a coin left overnight in damp earth. I felt the breath travel up through my body and unhook my ribs like a zipper. My breathing ceased to be mine. It was a machine folded into me, ticking and stuttering, and with every tick something in my chest rewired itself. They spoke without moving. Their voices were a chorus made from 100 languages, each saying nothing and everything. A syllable uncoiled in my skull, and then another, until there was a tide of sounds that reorganized my bones. They said nothing I could translate, but I understood them exactly as you understand hunger. Not with reason, but with the body. You left the door unlocked, they said at once, and in no particular order, and I knew with a clarity that felt like a verdict that the joint had been a key, and the smoke had been a hand turning it. My skin crawled. The sensation of being observed slid under my skin and set up a bivouac in my marrow. Small things happened that are worth remembering because they are the pieces you assemble into later explanations. My tongue felt papery, like tissue paper soaked, and then dried. My vision tunneled into kaleidoscopic slivers so that whatever I looked at multiplied and rotated into proofs of itself. The guitar in the corner undulated, strings thinning and thickening like the veins of a leaf. From the guitar there issued a low chant, the kind of chant that wears a skull's patience. Pain, the kind that is not accompanied by an obvious source, arrived with the same blunt honesty as a weather change. My teeth ached with a pressure like someone was trying to rearrange them. My jaw felt like a cabinet of drawers that someone was sliding open and closed. I wanted to scream, but sound had been rationed. When I opened my mouth, a wet gurgle came out, and it belonged to someone else's throat. Panic swelled into a physical presence, a cold animal pressing against the center of my chest, and the hallucinations matched it step for step, intensifying as if to match my dread. At the center of everything, a thing began to form. It did not arrive whole. It was assembled from parts of the room. A curtain's fringe became its hair. The pattern of the carpet became the texture of its skin. The dent in the lamp became the shape of its skull. It preferred symmetry as a joke and asymmetry as a threat. It had many mouths layered on top of one another like geological strata. Each mouth said a different name in a language that felt like a scrape. One of the names it said was mine, but not in the tender way a friend calls you, in the way a ledger calls an account, as an entry. I cannot describe its eyes because they were not made to be looked at. They were like the back of a hallucination, the place where the scenery hides the machinery. When I met them, or when it met me, the room tilted into a direction that was not forward or backward, but into something parallel and ancestral. The sensation felt like dying in slow reverse. I could feel my autobiography unraveling. Childhood moments I had never thought about. The exact pattern of the wallpaper in my first bedroom, the texture of a grandmother's voice, sped past in a carousel of evidence. Each memory came with a sting of regret, as though my life had been a ledger, and now the demon was checking the columns. It spoke to me then, not with words, but with architecture. Hallways rearranged themselves into sentences. The sentence, if it can be called that, resolved into a blunt image, a door within a door within a door, and behind the final slit of light, a thing that had been waiting a very long time. It smelled of the sea and of iron and of money. It was not merciful. Mercy implies a choice. This thing simply existed, and my existence was now one of its instruments. I tried to fight. I tried to anchor myself with the technique I had read about in some sober blog at 3 a.m, when insomnia was my friend. Focus on the 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. It was useless. The universe refused to play by that order. What I could see multiplied into 1,000 nested vistas. What I could touch slipped into other hands. What I could hear became an orchestra of bone. The rules of my world were boarded up and a new set of laws put up in their place, written in a scrawl that made my gums ache. The demonic imagery was not all metaphor. At one point, an arm detached from the air and crawled along the coffee table like a beetle. It had fingers that ended in serrated crescents, nails like the edge of a snapped vinyl record. It tapped rhythmically on the wood as if keeping time with my pulse. The tap was a metronome, and each tick tightened the cage of panic. When it reached the edge of the table, it paused and looked at me. The palm opened and revealed an arrangement of symbols burned into the skin. Runes, or perhaps fingerprints from a long-dead currency. I stared until my eyes watered. My reflection in the window betrayed me in another way. There was a time when you could read your face like a map of your mood. But that night the reflection was a ledger of sins. Not ones I had committed in the moral sense, but the small day-to-day betrayals. Days I'd called in sick and gone to the park instead. The way I'd left a lover without explaining. The lie I'd told my mother about the rent. They were all there, and the reflection had the patience of a judge. The demon, the thing made of curtains and carpet and smashed light, devoured these smaller betrayals like an animal tearing the meat from a bone. Each swallowed sin seemed to make it larger. At some point the world decided to teach me about eyes again. Millions of tiny pinprick eyes opened across the walls, along the lamp's shade, inside the grain of the wooden table. They blinked in a slow collective pulse, and the sound was like chalk on a neglected blackboard. Behind each eye something moved. Behind each movement something older writhed, a history of small cruelties and long indifferences. The feeling was that of walking through a library where every book was a memory of my failings, and the trustee of the library was patient and implacable. Then the most terrible thing, a sense that the thing wanted me to choose. It presented me with a mirror, not literal, but in a way that felt worse, where I could see two futures in the same frame. One showed me returning to my life, the room returning to normal, the friends laughing again, the weather degenerating to its usual gray. The other showed a corridor opening out of the apartment into a vast, tiled expanse that smelled like thunder, an endless space where the demon's voice echoed, and people wandered, hollow-eyed, reciting recipes and addresses and the names of their childhood pets like absolution. The choice, impossible as it was, sat between my ribs like a coin waiting to be flipped by a hand that wasn't mine. I begged without sound. My mouth moved, my lips formed prayer, apology, bargaining. The demon, its mouths layered like the strata of a record, chuckled. Sound was a scraping of leaves against a grave. "We prefer honesty," it said. And with that phrase the room began to consume color, as if everything were being filmed in slow monochrome. My friend's face, usually a landscape of mole and freckle, began to drain into a pattern of lines like a banknote worn thin. The world was converting into something useful. I do not know how long any of it lasted. Minutes? Hours? A day from which I would never reclaim the early hours? The compound altered my clock and distributed its theft liberally. I remember the moment of cleaving, an instant where everything lined up and then snapped like brittle wire. The demon, having satisfied itself with a sequence of images and a list of names, recoiled into a corner of the room as if retreating from light. The faces blurred and began to unglue. The architecture folded back into itself. The carpet knit itself into a pattern again. The air that had been occupied by 100 voiced languages thinned to make room for the small, steady drone of an air conditioner. I fell through the remainder like a dropped puppet. The sensation of returning to my body was not gentle. It was like stepping through a curtain smeared in cold varnish. My bones felt new and foreign in the same breath. They were both my armor and a relic. I could not speak for a long time. My friend beside me, his face white as paper and twice as thin, held my shoulder like an anchor. Someone clicked a lighter and cursed, and in that ordinary sound there was a salvation I had not known I wanted, the mundane chain of tiny human noises that stitch the edges of life together. I vomited later, finally, the taste of coins and ash and an old storm gutter. What came out was ambiguous, brown, tarry, nothing that could be catalogued as a verdict. After the heaving, sweat cooled on my neck and the ceiling stopped breathing. The room looked as it had that evening, light and shadow resolving into believable versions of themselves. But the air carried a residue like a whisper. My sense of time was flecked with the memory of that other architecture, the doors within doors, and I felt as if a small weather system had passed through my chest and left a bruise. Recovery, such as it was, did not come quickly. In the hours and days that followed, I found myself watching corners for the teeth of the world. A busker's harmonica would trigger a recall so complete it felt like nausea. A laugh would crack open a memory of that layered mouth, and I would hear the countdown of its teeth. I had nightmares afterwards, not necessarily of the thing, but of my own life fragmenting into endless rooms in which people I knew stood motionless and watched me with the patience of clocks. Friends tried to reassure me. They said it would pass, that it had passed before for others, that maybe I had been unlucky, that someone had spiked the joint as a prank or as something worse. The word spiked felt blunt and unsatisfactory. It reduced the experience to a neat crime when what I had lived through wanted to be metaphysical. I wanted to know who had done it, to put a face to the intention. I wanted an answer that would stitch the horror into a narrative that made sense. I felt foolish when the explanation proved smaller than the dread human malice, or carelessness, or both. The chemical, however named and however it had come to rest on dried cannabis, had been a key. It had been a key that opened a door I could not unsee. Weeks later, the residue of the episode remained in the corners of my mind like a slow mildew. I found that the world had acquired new thresholds, moments in which everything could slip, and others where it held. I learned to notice the texture of time in the way I noticed the grain of wood under my fingertips. I learned to count the steady, ordinary sounds of the night as if they were talismans, a refrigerator humming, someone's distant car, the tap in the bathroom. I learned to believe in small, simple things, again because the demon had taught me how precarious my belief in the ordinary could be. There is something obscene in writing this down, to fix, in language, a thing that thrived on being unfixable. The memory resists translation into a report or a cautionary tale because the truth of it is not cautionary in an ordinary sense. It is not even moral. It is a demonstration of how narrow the doors are between what we call ourselves and whatever else is waiting, patient, on the other side. It showed me that my life is a fragile architecture and that molecules, named and unnamed, assembled by chemists or pranksters or bored people with a cruel sense of experiment, can open doors better left closed. Sometimes I still dream of the arm that crawled across the table. Sometimes in a crowd, I catch a sliver of motion that looks like the lamp's dent, and my skin remembers the sound of teeth. Mostly, though, I remember the smallest, most unexpected rescue, a laugh, my friend's crass joke about something banal, the way the landlord's dog barked twice in the morning like a metronome. The ordinary, mundane world calls back to me in its small, stubborn cadence. It is not a certainty, it is a refusal to yield. If there is a lesson in this story, it is not one of judgment or lecture. It is a small, precise truth. The things you casually accept, the joint in a circle, the anonymous offering handed over with a smile, contain more potential than you can see. Something as innocent seeming as a rolled paper can carry a key. And once a door is opened, the room it reveals may be full of things that do not care for your language, your jokes, your apologies. They will take what they need anyway, an image, a name, a portion of your attention. You may survive. You may come back stitched up and tremulous, carrying an ache for the ordinary world. Or you may not recognize the life you had when you left it. I am writing this because the images keep arriving like postcards, unbidden. I am writing it because if my memory has become a ledger, perhaps the act of recording is how I repay the debt. I do not tell you to fear every offered cigarette or passed joint. Fear is a blunt tool. But do not treat the occasional gesture of trust as a small thing. Sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones with the most teeth.